Hey everybody, this is a piece from the New Dialectic in Marx's Capital titled A Clock Without, by Chris Arthur. The piece is titled A Clock Without a Spring, Epitaph for the USSR. Um, the reason I'm reading this is because I'm trying to, I've read this actually piece before, but I'm trying to just compile pieces from read a lot of the primary source material from Western Marxism in the Soviet Union by Marcel van der Linden, and this is part of Western Marxism in the USSR by Marcel van der Linden, and this is part of master's research I'm working on towards conceptualizing towards the early history of Trotskyist theories of the USSR and the critiques of Trotsky's degenerated worker state thesis within that movement. This is obviously written much later, but I believe that, I know that Chris Arthur comes out of a Trotskyist milieu and wrote in various Trotskyist papers, and so that's why I am reading it. That's my motivation here. But enough of my yak. Let's get busy. It is important following the, quote, fall, to point out that the debate over the nature of the Soviet Union is still germane to socialist theory and practice. Analysis of no longer existing socialism is significant more generally, for it is clear that the lessons are not specific to the extremes of the Russian situation, but are relevant to the theory and practice of transition in general. Indeed, it makes more pressing the question of what a real and permanent supersession of capitalism requires. Anyone interested in such a question must draw the lessons of this failed attempt, and anyone who is a Marxist must give an account of, quote, what went wrong, end quote, consonant with Marxist theory itself. 1 second. Gotta pick up the end notes. Here, where am I? There we are. The first such attempt was Leon Trotsky's Revolution Betrayed. For a critique of Trotsky, see C.G. Arthur's 1972 The Coming Soviet Revolution. It's not that critical. It's way less. That article is way less critical than, say, the work of the bureaucratic collectivists like Max Shachtman or Hal Draper or Julius Jacobson or any of those people, and it's less critical than the international socialist tendency around Tony Cliff. Certainly less critical than non-Trotskyist ultra-left types, say like Paul Maddock. Where am I? End footnote. Where am I? In the second part of this chapter, I sketch some views on these questions. In the third part, I consider the views of István Mészáros embedded in his larger work, Beyond Capital. I've liked a lot of the talks I've seen from István Mészáros. I'm going to read his little Wikipedia page real quick. István Mészáros lived from 1930 to 2017 and was a Hungarian Marxist philosopher, described as, quote, one of the foremost political philosophers of the late 20th and early 21st century, end quote, by Monthly Review. Mészáros wrote mainly about the possibility of a transition from capitalism to socialism. His magnum opus, Beyond Capital, Toward a Theory of Transition, published in 1995, was concerned not only with this theme, but provided a conceptual distinction between capitalism and capital, and an analysis of the current capitalist society and its, quote, structural crisis. Mészáros was interested in the critique of the, quote, bourgeois ideology, including the idea of, quote, there is no alternative, and he also elaborated analysis on the failures of, quote, real socialism. Mészáros was born in Budapest, Hungary. He was raised by his single mother and his maternal grandmother, and at age 12 falsified his birth date to work along with his mother in an airplane factory building engines. The poor working conditions would later arise, quote, his lifelong hatred for exploitation and depression, end quote. When he was 15 or 16, Maceras was introduced to the Marxist philosophy during visits to a bookshop. After having contact with Karl Marx's The 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon and Friedrich Engels' Anti-Düring and Marx and Engels' The Communist Manifesto, Maceras became interested in the works of Georg Lukács about Hungarian literature. Maceras liked Lukács's work, quote, so much that he even sold personal belongings to buy them and decided to enter the University of Budapest. He did so in 1949 when he won a scholarship with the emergence of a communist state in Hungary. At the university, Maceras affiliated himself to the so-called, quote, Budapest School, a group of Hungarian philosophers who were taught or influenced by Lukács, including Agnes Heller and Georgi Marcus. During this period, Lukács was very criticized by the Hungarian Communist Party, and Matyas Rákosi's government banned some of Lukács's works between 1949 and the mid-1950s. Because of his allegiance to Lukács and his attendance at Lukács's seminars, Maceras almost got expelled from the university. Later, Lukács nominated Maceras as his assistant at the Institute of Aesthetics because of his public contestation of the censorship of Mihaly Vörösmarty's play. I can't read that. It's like Kasangora as Tunda, I guess is how you say it, denounced as a, quote, pessimist aberration, end quote. Maceras's pro-Vörösmarty essay, published in the literary magazine Kisillag, earned Maceras the 1951 Attila József Prize and helped the reincorporation of the play into the National Theatre's repertoire. During the 1950s, Maceras was an active member of the Hungarian Writers' Union, was involved in artistic and literary circles, notably in the anti-Stalinist Petőfi Circle, a group associated with the Hungarian Revolution of 1956. This interest for cultural issues reverberated in his 1955 doctoral dissertation in philosophy entitled Satire and Reality. In the following year, Maceras was made editor of the cultural magazine Eszmélet, created by Lukács, composer Zoltán Kodály, and other personalities. Maceras was also chosen to be an associate professor of philosophy and Lukács' successor at the Institute of Aesthetics. However, after the defeat of the revolution and Lukács' imprisonment for supporting it, Maceras verified that, quote, there was no hope for socialist transformation in Hungary, end quote. After the Soviet invasion in 1956, Maceras left the country, becoming one of the first citizens from a communist country to criticize Stalinism. Maceras moved to Italy and was professor at the University of Turin. During his time in Turin, he wrote a book of memoirs about the Hungarian uprising titled The Revolt of the Intellectuals in Hungary that was published in 1958 by Giulio Einaudi, editor. Maceras worked in Italy until moving to the United Kingdom, where he worked at Bedford College, London, between 1959 and 1961, and the University of St. Andrews, 1961 to 1966. In 1964, he released the book Attila József et l'art moderne through the Milanese publisher Lirisi. Maceras joined the University of Sussex in 1966, which is where Chris Arthur taught as well, where he held the chair of philosophy. Christopher Arthur also taught philosophy there. Maceras's book, Marx's Theory of Alienation, established his reputation in the English-speaking world and won Maceras that year Isaac Deutscher Memorial Prize. Receiving the award, Maceras got the opportunity to do the first Isaac Deutscher Memorial Lecture at the London School of Economics in the following year. Originally conceived as, quote, alienation and social control, end quote, in late 1970, the lecture was renamed the, quote, necessity of social control. In 1971, it appeared under the title Alienation and the Necessity of Social Control in the Socialist Register and was also published by Merlin Press in book format as The Necessity of Social Control. In late 1972, Maceras was appointed professor of philosophy to teach political theory courses at University of Toronto and then resigned his position at Sussex. However, he had his visa refused by the Canadian government because his entry was not, quote, in the best interest of the country, end quote, and he posed a, quote, security risk. Sussex fellows Tom Baltimore Roy Edgley and Lawrence Lerner spoke against the government decision, as well as did York University officials and 30 University British Columbia faculty members and students led by historian Jan M. Bach. After accusations of being a, quote, Russian spy for the KBG, a letter to Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau by political scientist C.B. McPherson, Maziera's deportation, and the change of the immigration minister from Bryce McCaskey to Bob Andrus, Maseras was allowed to enter Canada legally in January 1973. After that, he worked as a senior professor of York's social and political thought program for 3 years after returning to Sussex. Maseras collected and edited 13 1958 to 1976 essays by Philippine historian Renato Constantino in a book titled Neocolonial Identity and Counterconsciousness Essays in Cultural Decolonization, first published by Merlin Press in 1978 and then by M.E. Sharp in 1979. Neocolonial Identity and Counterconsciousness Essays in Cultural Decolonization contained a 23-page introduction, which would later be republished in Journal of Contemporary Asia as part of a tribute done in 2000 after Constantino's death. Maseras was appointed Emeritus Professor by Sussex in 1991, and he won the Lukács Prize in 1992. In 1995, Maseras retired from Sussex, was nominated for the Michael Harrington Award for his work beyond capital, and was also elected as a member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. In the late 1990s, Maseras became an advisor to monthly review editors Harry Magdoff and John Bellamy Foster, and also contributed to the magazine and its parent monthly review press. In 2009, he won the Venezuelan Premio Libertador al Pensamiento Crítico for his work, The Challenge and Burden of Historical Time. After this work, he also published the 2-volume critique of, quote, bourgeois ideology, social structure and forms of consciousness, the social determination of method in 2010, the dialectic of structure and history in 2011. Following the publication of the latter, he planned to write a sequel for Beyond Capital entitled Beyond Leviathan, Critique of the State. Maseras drafted 3 volumes, The Historic Challenge, The Harsh Reality, and The Necessary Alternative, with the first volume almost completed. However, in 2017, Maseras died in Margate, where he was being cared for after a stroke in September made him leave his home in Ramsgate, Kent. Maseras was a critic of politicians and philosophers who constantly used the sentence, quote, there is no alternative, usually associated with conservative figures like Margaret Thatcher. Maseras stated it reached Labour Party's communist statesmen like Mikhail Gorbachev, and former radicals turned postmodernists. Because of this, he believed Jean-Paul Sartre was an important philosopher to whom, quote, Marxists owed a great debt to, end quote. Critical of Sartre's existentialism, Maseras praised his opposition to the, quote, there is no alternative, end quote, motto, and affirmed, quote, I don't embrace his ideas, but I embrace the aim, end quote. Maseras declared, quote, Sartre was a man who always preached the diametrical opposite. There is an alternative. There must be an alternative. You, as an individual, have to rebel against this power, this monstrous power of capital. Marxists, on the whole, failed to voice that side, end quote. Maseras. This was reflected in Maseras' work, this work of Sartre, Search for Freedom, first published in 1979 and expanded in 2012 with a new section titled The Challenge of History. Maseras believed it was important to do a distinction between capitalism and capital to theorize about a transition to socialism. Maseras posited that capital appeared, quote, thousands of years, end quote, prior to capitalism, and that it can continue without capitalism, which is the case of the Soviet Union in Maseras' understanding. In this sense, a revolutionary upheaval can overthrow capitalism in a limited area by the expropriation of the capitalist class, but the power of capital can still control the system through the division of labor and the, quote, hierarchical command structure of capital, end quote. Maseras defined capital as, quote, command system whose mode of functioning is accumulation-oriented, end quote. In his conception, the extraction of surplus value can be done in a, quote, political way, like in the case of the USSR, or through, quote, an economically regulated extraction of surplus labor and surplus value, end quote, like in the West. And I don't know how accurate this Wikipedia is, but this is going to be probably an important thing that Arthur criticizes. Maybe I'll be wrong about that, but Arthur seems to someone who would definitely criticize this kind of trans-historical use of the term of surplus value, the trans-historicization of value, as opposed to, say, exploitation. Right? You can have surplus labor extracted from direct producers, but that surplus can take the form of take an in-kind form, and not necessarily have a base in value. Maceros argued that the accumulation process, quote, was done in a very improper fashion from the point of view of productivity, end quote, and in a 1982 essay said that it would eventually collapse because of this fact and not because of U.S.-backed anti-communist military policies. Maceros met his Italian wife, Donatella Maurici, in 1955 in Paris. They were married on the 14th of February 1956. She died in 2007. They had 3 children: Laura, born 1956, Susie, born 1960, and Giorgio, born in 1962. Okay, back to the text. In the second part of this chapter, I sketched some views on these questions. In the third part, I consider the views of István Maceros embedded in his larger work, Beyond Capital. Wikipedia says, in Beyond Capital, the internationally esteemed Marxist philosopher István Maceros provides a major contribution to the task of reassessing the socialist alternative and the conditions for its realization in the light of 20th century developments and disappointments. Maceros brings original Marxist thinking to bear on the most fundamental issue facing the left: how to move theoretically beyond capital, beyond the project that Marx began and which he articulated under a specific form of commodity capitalism, as well as beyond the power of capital itself. Steeped in the philosophical roots and revolutionary world outlook of early Marxism, broad in scope and stunning in its erudition, Beyond Capital brilliantly challenges the European-based conceptual framework of socialist theory and begins the urgent task of elaborating a new socialist theory of transition. Okay, back to the text again. But first, let us set the scene for our analysis of the transition from capitalism to the USSR by addressing the question. I think it might be a typo. But let us first set the scene for our analysis of the transition from capitalism in the USSR by addressing the question of the dialectic of form and content. New section: Form and content. It is necessary first to distinguish between matter and form on the one hand and content and form on the other. If I cut a gingerbread man out of dough, the dough is the matter out of which the form is made, but it is not a content. The same form could be made out of any workable material, and the matter is indifferent to the form externally imposed on it. Parenthesis, a more interesting case is the logical form of a proposition being independent of the variables in it. In parenthesis. I don't know if I said parenthesis the first time, but that was parenthesis the last sentence. We speak here then of the two sides indifferently united. Footnote. The form-matter distinction is not absolute. There is no such thing as completely formless matter. It is more a question of the reforming of matter that is at issue. And footnote. When we have a case of form and content, the two sides penetrate one another such that just this form fits just this content. We require this of a book in which the content should take the form of an orderly arrangement, but in which what counts as orderly is not determined solely by formal considerations, but is itself a function of the content. For example, certain statements function as beginnings, quote, once upon a time, end quote, and certain statements as endings, quote, they lived happily ever after, end quote. Let us now apply these categories to the history of capitalism. Capital is in form self-valorizing value, but the purposes of this discussion Before the purposes of this discussion, the process of valorization may be taken as embodied in the material process of production, and the latter treated as a content taking the shape of capital's production of itself through appropriating surplus labor. It is often said that capital precedes capitalism, by which is meant that other forms of capital preceded industrial capital. Although Marx himself said this, in one place at least, Marx recognized that strictly speaking this is false, because sheer form without adequate content is not capital. Quote, money can be lent out to productive purposes, hence formally as capital. Although capital has not yet taken control of production, there is no capitalist production yet, hence no capital exists yet in the strict sense of the word, ... Like merchants' wealth, it only needs to be formally capital in a function in which capital can exist before capital has taken control of production. Capital which has taken control of production alone is the basis of a historical mode of social production of its own, end quote. Marx, Economic Manuscripts of 1861 to 63. That's where the theories of surplus value is located, I believe. Only in this latter form does capital gain an adequate content. Merchant and money lending capital have the form of self-valorizing value, but lack an adequate content. The merchant certainly profits from circulating commodities, but the merchant does not produce these commodities himself. The quote matter of his valorizing process is externally given. Footnote. For more on this, see C.J. Arthur 2000, From the Critique of Hegel to the Critique of Capital, end footnote. Marx shows that capital in the hands of usurers and merchants may exploit the direct producer through the exercise of market power, even when the latter is not formally subsumed under capital. Then Marx distinguishes within capitalism two different stages of development of the capital relation. The formal subsumption of the pre-capitalist labor process, which remains materially the same in this first stage, and the real subsumption of labor as capital transforms the labor process into an adequate content for capital. The quote, formal subsumption of labor under capital, end quote, obtains simply when, quote, the labor process is subsumed under capital, parenthesis, it is capital's own process. It is capital's own process, end parenthesis, and the capitalist enters the process as the process's conductor, the process's director, end quote. I think this is from, I'm not sure. I wonder if the, the results of the immediate process of production, what's it called? I keep fucking talking about this thing in all these videos. The results of the immediate process of production, I'm upset that my video isn't in the list of videos. But the results of the immediate process of production I was listening to that this morning, and I'm guessing that's drawn from the Economic Manuscripts of 1861 to 63, which I didn't know. Anyway, that's where that quote's from. But this quote, subsumption under capital of a mode of labor already developed before the emergence of the capital relation, end quote, forms a great contrast, quote, to the specifically capitalist mode of production. Specifically capitalist mode of production, parenthesis, labor on a large scale, etc., end parenthesis, ... which revolutionizes the kind of labor done and the real mode of the entire labor process, end quote. Marx, Economic Manuscripts, 1861 to 63. Quote, the capital relation as a relation of compulsion is common to both modes of production, but the specifically capitalist mode of production also possesses other ways of extracting surplus value, end quote. Marx, Economic Manuscripts, 1861 to 63. With industrial capital, the unity of form and matter is at first still somewhat external insofar as the material process of production is that inherited from the past and merely formally subsumed under capital's categories. However, as Marx has shown, the process of production becomes really subsumed under capital when it is no longer possible for it to recover its pre-capitalist form. When the formerly independent artisan is reduced to a functional role within the, quote, collective labor, end quote, organized by capital, and when the scale and intensity of production become determined by the requirements of big industry. In some capitalist form, self-valorizing value now produces from within itself a content adequate to capital, the factory system. The key is capital subordination of the workers through a reorganization of the division of labor and the construction of a hierarchy of control. Only when form and content of a mode of production perfectly complement one another can one speak of a, quote, organic system, or of a, quote, social metabolism, end quote, something that will be important when we assess Maceros's contribution. Footnote, for Marx on the nature of a, quote, organic system, see Grundrisse, page 278 and page 100, end footnote. If they come into conflict, it spells decline and the objective necessity for a supersession. Let us now investigate what Marx had to say about the notion of, quote, metabolism, starting with the simplest idea introduced by Marx right at the beginning of Capital, quote, labor, is an eternal natural necessity which mediates the metabolism, bracket, Stoffwechsel, is it Wechsel? Is that how you say that? Is that how you say in German? ECHS? Is that X? I don't know. I'm going to go with X. I'm going to repeat that sentence because I fucked it up already. Let us now investigate what Marx had to say about the notion of, quote, metabolism, starting with the simplest idea introduced by Marx right at the beginning of Capital, quote, labor, is an eternal natural necessity which mediates the metabolism, bracket, Stoffwechsel, end bracket, between men and nature, and therefore human life itself, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Not surprisingly, the same theme is explored at greater length in the chapter on the labor process. The idea here refers to the immediate material life of human beings working upon nature, and in the chapter on the labor process, Marx considers it without reference to social forms such as exchange. However, exchange introduces a definite social determination to Stoffwechsel, because in commodity production no material consumption is possible unless products first change hands in the commodity form. Marx says, quote, we therefore have to consider the whole process in the whole process's formal aspect, that is to say, the change in form, bracket, Formwechsel, end bracket, of the metamorphosis of commodities through which the social metabolism, bracket, Stoffwechsel, end bracket, is mediated, end quote. Marx, Capital, Volume 1. Footnote. Contrary to the Pringlant translator Ben Fawkes, this was not the first place Marx uses the term Stoffwechsel. We have seen it earlier in Capital itself, and it was first employed 10 years before in Marx's Grundrisse, as we shall see below. End footnote. And a little later, Marx refers to the, quote, Formwechsel, wherein the, quote, Stoffwechsel of the products of labor is accomplished. The emphasis is here not on a relation between, quote, man and nature, but the exchange of products between, quote, man and man, end quote, mediated in the social form of circulation. These two different aspects of the social metabolism are dialectically integrated in the process of capitalist production and circulation, a matter first explored in the Grundrisse. Quote, in the circulation of capital we have ... a system of exchanges, exchange of matter, Stoffwechsel, in bracket, if seen from the angle of use value, a change of form, Formwechsel, end bracket, if seen from the angle of value as such, end quote. Marx, Economic Manuscripts of 1857 to 58. It's the Grundrisse. End footnote. In Volume 2 of Capital, Marx returns to this subject in the first part on the metamorphoses of capital, in which Marx demonstrates that the unity of the change in matter effected in production with the exchange of matter in circulation is accomplished in the circuit of forms of capital, namely money capital, production capital, and commodity capital. It is, quote, within the circuit of capital, ... that the metabolism, Stoffwechsel, end bracket, of social labor takes place, end quote. Footnote. Marx, Capital, Volume 2. The translator's note referring us back to the chapter on the labor process is, in my view, slightly inaccurate. The context seems to indicate Marx was thinking more of the exchange of products discussed in Capital, Volume 1, pages 198 to 199. End footnote. Finally, in the last part of Volume 2, Marx shows that the system of reproduction, embracing the formal and material interchanges between, quote, departments, constitutes the social metabolism of the entire capitalist economy, within which production, exchange, and consumption are interior, quote, moments. The investigation of these coincident exchanges is crucial to the secret of value and use value, and their interpenetration. In particular, one must speak here of, quote, form determination. Capital goes beyond mere form in penetrating, rather than abstractly counterposing itself to, the matter it regulates in order to shape it into its own content. Parenthesis, real subsumption of labor, for example, end parenthesis. Valorization is something which can be discovered in a factory no more than can value in a commodity, but it is nevertheless the key to comprehending what is occurring. The theoretical problem is rightly elucidating the effectivity of formal and material determination is to conceptualize how Formwechsel and Stoffwechsel work together in a unified system of capitalist social metabolism. The point is missed by those, quote, materialists, such as Stedman Jones. What's his name? Gareth Stedman Jones? The point is missed by those, quote, materialists, such as Gareth Stedman Jones, writing here in the New Palgrave article on, quote, dialectical reasoning, quote, the relationship between matter and form in Hegel is only of apparent exteriority. Matter relates to form as other only because form is not yet posited within it. Once the terms are related, they are declared to be identical. Marx, on the other hand, insists upon the irreducible difference between matter and form, between the material and the social, ... Not only are matter and form different, but the one determines the other, values determined in relation to the material production of use value. The opposite is not true, end quote. Footnote. Gareth Stedman Jones, 1990, article Dialectical Reasoning. There has to be something wrong with the last sentence of this passage. No amount of dissection of material use value or the process of use value's production will turn up value. So in what sense is value conceivably determined by it? Capital creates value in virtue of capital's sui generis form. Of course, for Marx, it is relative labor times that determine relative values, but value as a form is clearly constituted in exchange, and insofar as the Marxian point about relative magnitudes is accepted, it is the value form of capital itself that determines that labor time is to be the necessary dimension of its content. What is missing in Stedman Jones is the concept of mediation, a unity of opposites that keeps the two sides distinct, as he insists, but allows that they inform each other, not that one is either reducible to the other or else its mere epiphenomenon. The distinction between formal and material determination and their unity must be considered. Footnote: a good analogy is computing. There is the software logic, which is here the demand of valorization flowing from the form, and the firing sequence in the hardware, which is the production process. The question is how far the hardware supports the software. One could argue that at a minimum, the hardware must have the labor-powered chip in it. End footnote. The former, quote, ideally, the distinction between formal and material determination, quote, ideally, gives sense and purpose, while the formal and the material's unity conditions. The distinction between formal and material determination and their unity must be considered. Formal determination, quote, ideally, gives sense and purpose, while the material determination conditions the formal determination by the potentials and limits of the matter concerned. Yeah, I mean, this is kind of like a thing within like why dialectical thinking is so important for a lot of the more value form analysis, as well as like political Marxism, which kind of talks about really emphasizes the distinction, the relation of a specific social form of production on like the material substratum of production, right? And the kind of like non-economic determinists, which usually means technological determinists, not economic in the general sense. But that's I would say that in terms of like dialectical causality, to my understanding, I'm not a fucking expert on dialectics, but like dialectical causality would mean like, the reciprocal relation between two poles, two aspects of a thing, right? As opposed to a linear causation, right? Which would mean that that would view the causal change strictly as coming from some kind of lower or more primary order, right? So like it's usually some kind of form of reductionism. A determinism that is strictly linear usually is reductionist, right? So like an example in like philosophy of mind would be like brain produces thought, and thought doesn't have downward causation back on itself, back on the brain. And you could say that in a dialectic, you could say that that like thoughts are kind of like something that's produced but has no causal effect back on consciousness itself, or something like that. It doesn't go back down the chain. It doesn't have downward causation, as you might call it in like philosophy of like emergence. But a dialectical relationship is one in which there's that linear causation is not present. So so for instance, like a really linear understanding would be like technological determinism. And you can see these things. You can see like comments to this effect in Marx. You can see other ones, I think, especially in like especially in the results of the immediate production process. You see the way that like the material substratum of capitalism is determined by certain imperatives of the form of capital itself, right? You can see, but you also see in Marx things like, oh, this is, I can't remember the exact quote, but the society with, like, the hammer gives you this, and the society with the steam engine gives you this, and the society with this gives you this, right? It's kind of like this very linear kind of thing, of notion of causality, right? It's or you can see like base always determines superstructure would be another example of a non-dialectical mechanical interpretation of Marxism. Because like a mechanical worldview as opposed to an organic worldview, to my understanding, I mean, I'm riffing here about my knowledge, but like a mechanical understanding of the universe, right, is that there was some kind of like great creator, right? I think that was a lot of the things of like the mechanical approach to the cosmos or whatever, the clock things, like there was like a mechanism that initiated things, and everything kind of falls out of this like original event. Whereas an organic conception of causality is acknowledges the reciprocal nature between different moments that are they're causally relevant for each other, right? So in a body, right, you can't really think of a nervous system without the I don't know, cardiovascular system or whatever, and you can't think of them with like in the absence of each other. They reciprocally need each other. I don't know if you can't say like the nervous system causes the other system, and this other system doesn't cause the other system, because you need them together. They reciprocate with each other in kind of a systematic, as a systematic whole, right? That's like the organic way of thinking of something. Organic causation, as opposed to mechanical causation, is non-linear. And then there's I think of dialectical, as opposed to like a system, strictly speaking, like a systems analysis usually gives greater scope for conflict and contradictions, right, within a system, right? So if you're talking about capitalism as a whole, it's not that capitalism isn't like this peaceful thing that just like kind of like exists as a whole and like doesn't have any kind of like crisis or contradictions in itself. It's not that kind of a whole. It's not a peaceful organic whole. It's a very conflictual organic whole. But yeah, Stedman Jones's quote here kind of seems something to the effect of like, gives a very I don't know, non-dialectical explanation of dialectics. At least, I guess if I read the quote closer, I'd have a different evaluation. Now let's read Gareth Stedman Jones' Wikipedia real quick. I know he wrote a big a Marx biography that Michael Heinrich thinks sucks, in terms of it's just like it's at least like its premises. Gareth Stedman Jones, born 1942, is an English academic and historian, a professor of the history of ideas at Queen Mary University of London. Gareth Stedman Jones deals particularly with working class history and Marxism. Educated at St. Paul's School and Lincoln College, Oxford, where he graduated in history in 1964. Stedman Jones went on to Nuffield College, Oxford, to take a Doctor of Philosophy in 1970. Gareth Stedman Jones moved to Cambridge in 1974, becoming a Fellow of King's College, Cambridge, and in 1979, a lecturer in history. He was Research Fellow at Nuffield College, Oxford, from 1967 to 1970, a Senior Associate member of St. Anthony's College, Oxford. In 1971 and 1970 to 1972, and an Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung Fellow, Department of Philosophy, Goethe University, Frankfurt, 1973 to 1974, before becoming a lecturer in history at Cambridge in 1979 to 1986, and a reader in history of social thought there in 1986 to 1997. He served as a co-editor of the Center for History and Economics at King's since 1991 and held the post of Professor of Political Science from 1997 to 2010. In 2010, Stedman Jones became Professor of the History of Ideas at Queen Mary University of London. From 1964 to 1981, Stedman Jones served as on the editorial board of the New Left Review. Stedman Jones was a joint founder of the History Workshop Journal in 1976, bracket citation needed, and bracket in 2018, Stedman Jones's Intellectual Evolution. Reviewing Stedman Jones' Intellectual Evolution, historian Terence Renaud described a, quote, journey from the New Left through French structuralism to a contextualist practice of intellectual history that leaves Marxism behind. end quote. And his publications are Outcast London, 1971, Language of Class, Studies in English Working Class History, 1832 to 1982, 1983, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, The Communist Manifesto, published in 2002. He wrote the introduction to that. And End of Poverty, published in 2004. And Karl Marx, Greatness and Illusion, published in 2016. Back to the text. If it were not for the real historical existence of labor power and of the general framework of capitalist social relations, which ensures its exploitation, then there would be no self-expansion of value. But Marx also investigates the logic of social forms such as exchange, money, and capital. These real forms have a specific effectivity. Where am I? These forms... Where the fuck? God, I fucked up. If it were not for the real historical existence of labor power and the general framework of capitalist social relations, which ensures labor power's exploitation, then there would be no self-expansion of value. But Marx also investigates the logic of social forms such as exchange, money, and capital. These real forms have a specific effectivity, whereas on Stedman Jones's account, all the weight is given to the material content regulated and directed by such forms. While it is true that the forms cannot realize their logical potential unless materially supported, there is no surplus value without the exploitation of labor. It is equally true that the material potential is not realized without the compulsion exercised by the social form. It is capital that demands the continual reduction of socially necessary labor time. In sum, a full account of valorization requires both formal and material explanation. The key point is that the form determination of capital as infinitely self-expanding value means capitalism is utterly different from any other mode of production. In all modes of production, it is possible to seek ways of improving the productivity of labor, and all exploitative modes rely on some form of, quote, pumping out surplus labor. Only capital is, in point of form, as such, driven by this interest under the necessity to accumulate, quote, wealth. Capital is an original unity of form and content in the sense that form has a certain unique effectivity arising from its purely self-mediating character granted in circulation. The following quotation from Marx gives some sense of this in that what is emphasized in it is the value form rather than the so-called, quote, substance. Quote, to develop the concept of capital, it is necessary to begin not with labor, but with value, and precisely with exchange value in an already developed movement of circulation. It is just as impossible to make the transition directly from labor to capital as it is to go from the different human races to the banker, ... End quote. Marx. Grundrisse. Of course, systematic valorization depends upon capital sinking into production and appropriating labor, but value is not a form, quote, naturally taken on by labor, hence the impossibility of starting from labor. It is rather a form arising elsewhere and imposed on labor. In virtue of its form, capital is embarked on an endless drive for accumulation, but its self-determination as accumulative is limited by capital's reliance on land and labor as inputs to the production process. But as we know from Marx, capital first formally subsumes these factors under itself and then subordinates labor and machinery to its purpose through a material transformation of them and their organization, real subsumption. What is capital? Capital is value in process. Capital takes the form first of money, then of factors of production, then of commodities, then of more money. Whence this, quote, more, from the process of production where valorization of capital takes place. At the ideal level, capital is self-valorizing value. At the material level, capital is the pumping out of surplus labor in the factory system. In a very real sense, we may speak of the organization established to accomplish this operation as the materialization of capital, parenthesis, just as a chain gang is the materialization of slavery, end parenthesis. Marx makes the point in his Grundrisse, using the language of matter and form we already discussed, quote, in the machine, and even more in machinery as an automatic system, the use value, i.e., the material quality of the means of labor, is transformed into an existence adequate to fixed capital and to capital as such, and the form in which it was adopted into the production process of capital. The direct means of labor is superseded by a form posited by capital itself and corresponding to capital, ... The appropriation of living labor by objectified labor, of the power or activity which creates value by value existing for itself, which lies in the concept of capital, is posited in production resting on machinery, as the character of the production process itself, including its material elements and its material motion, ... The development of the means of labor into machinery is not an accidental moment of capital, but is rather the historical reshaping of the traditional inherited means of labor into a form adequate to capital. However, while capital gives itself its adequate form as use value within the production process only in the form of machinery and other material manifestations of fixed capital, such as railways, etc., this in no way means that this use value, machinery as such, is capital, or that its existence as machinery is identical with its existence as capital. End quote. Marx, Grundrisse. Mark well, just because it is impossible to understand the development of the factory system without grasping that it was shaped by capital so as to become its adequate content, this does not make the factory system capital itself. I'm going to repeat that because it's very important. Mark well, just because it is impossible to understand the development of the factory system without grasping that it was shaped by capital so as to become its adequate content, this does not make it capital itself. New section, the Soviet Union. Let us now turn to those post-revolutionary systems that claim to have superseded capitalism, in brief to the, quote, Soviet model. As far as social form is concerned, capitalism was destroyed in the USSR. It is not meaningful to speak of the system as having had value, surplus value, or capital accumulation. It should go without saying that development of heavy industry is not itself any sign of capital accumulation. It should go without saying that development of heavy industry is not itself any sign of capital accumulation. There was the price form and the wage form, but this in no way represented some appearance form of value, since they were fixed within a totally administered system, although of course such forms provide a point of transition to capitalism when political conditions put on this agenda, as we see today. What remained, however, was the materialization of capital, namely the factory system. For various historical reasons, this was never questioned. Socialism was proclaimed without radically overcoming the material embodiment of capital. Hence, the global factory in the USSR started from this capitalist model, of which the key element is the hierarchical division of labor, from those at the bottom who execute orders of others up to those involved in the 5-year plan process. The entire human/material configuration of capital's technique was replicated, but without the objective economic regulator of value measures. A factory is not a mode of production. it has to be specified further by what social form regulates it. Since the factory system was laid down through capital's own development, it followed that once separated from capital itself as a social form, this content lost the character precisely of being a content and became a material foundation of the new order. The great difference with capitalism is that the lack of an objective value regulator leaves the mechanism without a spring, i.e., there's no drive for capital accumulation. Furthermore, without being continually regulated by capital, this material presupposition ceased to be posited by capital as its presupposition, and hence became subject to a kind of, quote, drift. The Soviet factory became unlike capitalist factories in many respects. Footnote. See these informative studies. Donald Filzer, 1986, Soviet Workers and Statist Industrialization. F. Ferretti, The Soviet Union Demystified, and Hillel Tichton's 1992, Origins of the Crisis in the USSR, and Bob Arnaud's 1988, Controlling Soviet Labor. All right, I'm going to look these up because you know what? Why not? At least the ones I don't know. Donald A. Filzer's book, Soviet Workers. Oh, that's not the one I'm looking for. Actually, I don't see any good description of this book, which is unfortunate. Let's see if there's anything for this Ferretti book. I'm not seeing any for this Ferretti, the Soviet Union Demystified. I'm not going to look up Hillel Tichton's The Crisis, Origins of the Crisis in the USSR. That's on this channel. Arnaud, Controlling Soviet Labor. Let's look at that. Okay, so I think we actually do have a description for Controlling Soviet Labor by Bob Arnaud. The description says, with a growing population, deteriorating economic conditions, and an unstable imperial center, Soviet Central Asia would seem destined to become a trouble spot. That's not actually a description of this book. This is mislabeled. Mislabeling. That's wrong. It's not correct. Anyway, end footnote. Back to the text. End footnote. What was this new social form? It was certainly not socialism. Rather, the requirements of the inherited material base for some kind of direction led with extraordinary rapidity to a bureaucratic dictatorship. As Tichton has pointed out, to speak here of a, quote, planned economy is wildly inaccurate, but the basic information and monitoring systems were not in place because of the antagonism between planners and planned. At most, one can speak of an administered economy within which enterprise managers and workers survived as best they could. If it had been planned, there would have been a good, quote, fit between form and content, and it would have survived. The trouble arose precisely because the materialization of capital was freed from capital's controlling form, but without another organic system of social metabolism taking root and transforming more or less rapidly and radically the material basis of the economy. Being neither capitalism nor socialism, the USSR lacked organic coherence. According to Hillel Tichton, quote, there are only capitalism and its essence, the law of value, and socialism with its essence, the law of planning. Anything in between, ... has no essence, no laws except ones of formation and decay, end quote. Hillel Tichton. Footnote. The, quote, law of planning does not necessarily mean central planning of all details. Local self-management is necessary in order to integrate what Hilary Wainwright has called, quote, tacit knowledge possessed by the workers of a given enterprise, founded in experience and tradition of, quote, know-how, end footnote. This paradoxical character is expressed by Tickton when he says that it was not a mode of production at all, a fortiori neither, quote, state capitalism nor, quote, bureaucratic collectivism. The politically enforced directives were incapable of controlling the factories in such a manner as to promote the development of the productive forces in a stable and permanent fashion. Lenin, surprisingly for such a political thinker, was enthusiastic about the, quote, scientific management pioneered theoretically by Taylor and practically by Ford. On scientific management in the early Soviet Union, check out on a piece. It's on here by a guy named Rainer Traub, Rainertraub. But the truth is that Taylorism was never applied in the USSR, exclamation point. Stakhanovism, besides being purely a publicity stunt, was not scientific in Taylor's sense. The Traub essay would dispute this. The Soviets had no theoretical objection to it. They wanted to apply scientific management, but they were unable to do so because production was governed by a non-capitalist social form. It could not be applied in the USSR because it was tailor-made for capitalism. It is not, as Lenin seemed to imagine, a socially neutral body of knowledge. Moreover, Taylor would roll in his grave if anyone dared to associate Taylor with the gross overmanning characteristic of Soviet industry. Fiat built a factory for the Soviets. It took 4 times as many workers to run as exactly the same factory in Italy. The Soviet system was not a labor-saving system, but a labor-hoarding system. Clearly, where it was illegal to fire workers, managers had not much interest in saving labor time. Furthermore, they could not organize a just-in-time system because in the USSR, supply was never in time. Hence, it was important to build up and hoard stocks against such a drying up of supply for more or less long periods. Thus, Soviet production worked on the, quote, never-in-time system. The Soviet production took most of the month to get the machinery in order and the inputs delivered. Then, to meet the monthly targets, the factory engaged in a process known as, quote, storming, when everyone available worked until they dropped. Then another hiatus occurred, and so on. In fact, managers hoarded labor in case a period of, quote, storming to meet a planned deadline is required. I do not think Taylor would call this scientific management, exclamation point. Certainly the workers did not like the hanging about or the storming, and the consumer discovers the products of storming are defective. In sum, Taylor makes no sense when workers' jobs are guaranteed. The inefficiency of the central planning system, combined with the absence of a proper market, resulted in a paradoxical retrogression in the social division of labor. Ferretti explains, quote, the response of individual production units to the problem caused by the absence of economic regulation is to strive for a measure of self-sufficiency. Thus, instead of a mutually beneficial division of labor between enterprises, industries, and regions, the pattern is for the division of labor to be reproduced within each sector of the economy. End quote. Ferretti, the Soviet Union demystified. Hence, there was a fragmentation of the economy and inefficiency, because, quote, the goal of any enterprise manager is to reduce his reliance on the overall division of labor to a minimum to give the best chance of reaching centrally imposed performance targets, end quote. Ferretti, resources were kept hidden from the planners, and thus they could not effectively plan, for the planners did not know where the resources were. I have said, following Hillel Tickton, that there was no mode of production in the USSR. This purely negative definition does not mean much except as a promissory note on its collapse. Let me try to give the theory more substance. What is a mode of production? A mode of production is a stable, relatively harmonious combination of a social form and a material content. In Marx's glib aphorism, quote, the hand mill gives us society with the feudal lord, the steam mill society with the industrial capitalist, end quote. It must be understood that in the combination, The elements are not indifferent to one another, nor do they exhibit a one-way determination. Parenthesis, the Marx passage has been misread as a technological determinism, end parenthesis. Yeah, that's what I was talking about earlier. Rather, they are dialectically interrelated. Just this form shapes and develops just this content. Just this content embodies and reproduces materially just this form. Thus, it is the social form of capital that, through its tendency towards competition and enlarged production, brought forth the steam engine, and it was the enormous boost to labor productivity occasioned by the steam engine that enabled capitalism to stomp over pre-capitalist forms. If the social form and material content come into contradiction, this spells trouble. For example, Marx believed that the increasing socialization of the productive forces and associated labor processes will prove incompatible with their capitalist integument. What I argue is that the relations of production in the USSR always suffered from an incoherence of form and content. It was a self-aborting monstrosity. The matter is not unrelated to its inauspicious beginnings. Apart from the much-canvassed political dimensions, the isolated USSR had not the human and technical resources to avoid copying capitalist technique. But when the factory is brought under a quite different social form characterized by the absence of capitalist logic, and by employment guarantees, productivity goes out of the window. Exploitation is inefficient, and control must be exercised in a new way, i.e. by a bureaucratic apparatus backed up by a police state. This was then reinforced and reproduced as the emerging bureaucracy opted for maintaining their own position at the head of a hierarchical command structure. The interests of the capitalist are congruent with the growth of social wealth, but the individual interest of the bureaucrat is not. This is why there was no new mode of production. Adam Smith showed long ago that the capitalist benefited society simply in pursuit of his own interest. The interest of the worker, however, was not so self-evidently connected with social wealth, for doubling productivity is immediately in the interest of the capitalist, but leaves up to half the workforce unemployed. Now, bourgeois apologists may argue that the increase in social wealth will somehow generate new industries to re-employ these people, but this is a very indirect link, and the workers may be forgiven for trying to hold on to the jobs they have. The argument for socialism has always appealed to the idea that when the workers work, quote, for themselves, end quote, they will become interested in increasing production, and it will be possible to reorganize the technology of the factory to gain the full benefits of this. But in the USSR, the factory provided no avenue for workers' initiative, and in any case, their exclusion from control over the surplus gave them no guarantee that such efforts would benefit themselves or their families. Thus far, not much different from capitalism, but in fact worse than capitalism, for the individual bureaucrat had no immediate interest of his own in increasing social wealth either. Their rewards depended upon political favor, hence the resistance to innovation, the tendency to pass the buck and blame others when things went wrong, the hoarding of labor and materials against a future episode of, quote, storming. What a bureaucrat wants is above all a quiet life. The reason for what happened was not, quote, the adoption of Taylorism, end quote, but the necessity to maintain distinctions, to justify bureaucratic privilege, and prevent the self-organization of the workers. If we return to basics, we must start the social analysis not from the form of the state, but from the form of production. It was not production for profit, it was not production for need, it was production for targets laid down external to the logic of the production process itself. In the case of capitalism, we know that the law of value transmits from factory to factory the socially necessary labor times for any item, and that capital flows and technological innovation are mutually reinforcing. In the case of production for need, we might imagine some mutually informative institutionalization of producer/consumer relations. But the USSR had no such feedback loops. The targets had no relation to real needs, nor, more importantly, to the real resources and the real capabilities of the factories. No 5-year plan ever succeeded but had to be drastically reworked year on year. The so-called plans were meaningless because the information available was so corrupt by the political distortions of the system. And where the plan was fulfilled, it was often only in the letter and not the substance. The state interfered in the economy, but the system did not regulate itself in accordance with some inherent logic of its productive capacity. Thus, I would argue that the well-known phenomenon of a rapid expansion of basic factors of production, followed by chronic paralysis when diverse sophisticated products were required, should not be interpreted as effects of some economic law, but as a sign of a lack of law. A combination of political factors, coercion and voluntarist enthusiasm got things off the ground, but because no new mode of production was stabilized, the system could not run itself when the political pressures diminished. Footnote: a fascinating but imponderable question asked of me by Riccardo Bellafiore is whether or not, if there had been no more advanced external world competing with it, the USSR could have carried on indefinitely, absorbing its own inefficiencies. One recalls that it took war with superior economies to break down Tsarism. End footnote. Although the general run of commodities were defective, the system was capable of prioritizing allocation of materials, machinery. Why would he use that word commodity? I don't know. That seems like a very specific term to use here. Which, if it wasn't capitalist and there was no market, what is the meaning of calling the products of the USSR commodities? Although the general run of commodities were defective, the system was capable of prioritizing allocation of materials, machinery, and men to certain uses. That is why it worked in war, and why the concentration of scarce resources and the best talent in the armament sector could produce Sputnik. Of course, the presence of imperialism forced this priority on the system, which otherwise might have been more rewarding for certain layers of the population. While there was considerable extensive growth, this process itself was enormously wasteful. But the crucial problem was the retardation of intensive growth. Just to cite one problem here, how can the intellectual productive forces be developed on a broad scale when the rulers did not trust people with photocopiers? In order to make more plausible the claim that no mode of production exists in the USSR, let us observe that Ernest Mandel distinguished between specific relations of production, which must characterize any social formation, and a mode of production. This is, quote, one of the essential distinctions between periods of transition and the great, quote, progressive stages, end quote, of history outlined by Marx, end quote. Ernest Mandel on the nature of the Soviet state. A mode of production is an organic whole that reproduces itself almost automatically. It can only be replaced by violent social revolution. Quote, on the other hand, precisely because of their generally hybrid character, the relations of production of a society in transition between two modes of production can decompose of their own accord, evolve in various directions without necessarily experiencing revolutionary perturbations of the same type as the social revolutions necessary for the passage from one mode of production to another. End quote. Ernest Mandel on the nature of the Soviet state. 1978. So there were certainly relations of production of a sort, but no organic system of social metabolism. The whole experience demonstrates the wisdom of Marx's insight that economics is decisive over politics. The elite wanted to be a true ruling class, and it seemed they had all the power anyone could wish for, with the KGB, the Gulag, and the house-trained party millions. But they could not ground themselves on production. They poured out, quote, plans, quote, decrees, quote, orders, quote, reforms, but they could not deliver the goods. It was as simple as that. To summarize this sketch of history, in the pre-capitalist period, the form of capital emerged. In the capitalist period, it seized hold of production and shaped this matter into a content adequate to capital. In the post-capitalist period, this form of capital was extinguished, but this form of capital's material presuppositions were not radically transformed, but merely administered within new social relations, resulting in an uncontrolled process of deformation of the material basis in the context of continued failure for the form and matter to achieve a new organicity. Footnote. Of course, a more or less long period of transition to socialism is inevitable, but it can be argued that things would be very different if a transition were to occur with an educated workforce and a democratic tradition. Then self-management and political progress could be a real possibility. End footnote. New section. Beyond Capital. In the final part of this paper, I look closely at an impressively argued new book by Istvan Messeros, which contains a theory of transition worth discussing on its own account, and also for the purpose of further illuminating my own view of the Soviet Union, which overlaps with his. While the necessity of the socialist alternative is reasserted, Messeros also investigates the reasons for the collapse of the USSR. As the title Beyond Capital indicates, central to the book is the thesis that it is necessary not merely to go beyond, quote, capitalism, but beyond, quote, capital itself. A lot hangs on the coherence of this distinction, therefore. In particular, it is used to characterize Soviet-type regimes of production as being, quote, post-capitalist, yet still under the sway of, quote, capital. Messeros says, quote, the tragedy of Soviet-type post-capitalist societies was that they followed the line of least resistance, by positing socialism without radically overcoming the material presuppositions of the capital system, end quote. Messeros, Beyond Capital. This is outlined in a fascinating chapter on, quote, changing forms of the rule of capital, end quote. Capital's metabolism, based on its domination of alienated labor, on the predominance of exchange over use value, and on a hierarchical division of labor, is driven by the imperative of expansion. As a system with its own logic and coherence, it cannot be changed without tackling this central metabolic order and replacing it, tinkering with surface phenomena, e.g. juridical arrangements, will not change such fundamentals. Thus Messeros argues that without the positive transcendence of capital's metabolic functioning, quote, labor itself self-defeatingly continues to reproduce the power of capital over against itself, end quote. Messeros, Beyond Capital. Messeros concludes that, quote, the real target of emancipatory transformation is the complete eradication of capital as a totalizing mode of control from the social reproductive metabolism itself, and not simply the displacement of the capitalist as the historically specific, quote, personification of capital, end quote, end quote. Messeros, Beyond Capital. In an interview, Messeros expanded on this, quote, the bureaucracy is a function of this command structure under the changed circumstances, where in the absence of the private capitalist, you have to find an equivalent to that control, end quote. Messeros, Beyond Capital. In one version, the distinction between capital and capitalism is already familiar to us, for it is a commonplace that merchants and usurers employed money as capital long before capital seized hold of production and established the modern system of industrial capitalism. But it is novel to argue that capital may survive capitalism. But let us look first at his definition of capitalism. He argues that the capitalist formation extends over only that particular phase of capital production in which, quote, 1. Production for exchange is all-pervasive. 2. Labor power itself is a commodity. Let me repeat this. Quote, 1. Production for exchange is all-pervasive. 2. Labor power itself is a commodity. 3. The drive for profit is the fundamental regulator. 4. The vital mechanism for the extraction of surplus value, the radical separation of the means of production from the producers, assumes an inherently economic form. 5. Surplus value is privately appropriated by the members of the capitalist class. 6. Following its economic imperative of growth and expansion, capital production tends towards a global integration. end quote. Maceros, Beyond Capital. It follows from this definition, according to Maceros, that one cannot speak of, quote, capitalism in post-capitalist societies as we have known them. Yet at the same time, Maceros argues that, quote, capital maintains capital's rule in such societies. What then is the definition of, quote, capital that would be consistent with this survival? Maceros says necessary conditions of all conceivable forms of the capital relation, including the post-capitalist forms, are, quote, 1. The separation and alienation of the objective conditions of the labor process from labor itself. 2. The superimposition of such alienated conditions over the workers as a separate power exercising command over labor. 3. The personification of capital as, quote, egoistic value, end quote, pursuing its own self-expansion. The bureaucrat is the most... Wait, this isn't a quote. Fuck. 1. The separation of alienation and of the objective conditions of labor from labor itself. 2. The superimposition of such alienated conditions over the workers as a separate power exercising command over labor. 3. The personification of capital as, quote, egoistic value, end quote, pursuing its own self-expansion. The bureaucrat is the post-capitalist equivalent of the private capitalist. 4. The equivalent personification of labor, whether as wage laborer under capitalism or as the norm-fulfilling, quote, socialist worker, end quote, under the post-capitalist system. Quote, capital can change the form of capital's rule. Capital can change the form of its rule as long as these four basic conditions, which are constitutive of its, quote, organic system, end quote, are not radically superseded, end quote, Maceros concludes. The key conceptual innovation introduced by Maceros, then, is a distinction between capital and capitalism. Let us now examine Maceros' definition of these. The 5-point definition of capitalism Maceros gives is generally plausible, but I would challenge it at what might seem its strongest point, namely the criterion that surplus value is privately appropriated by the members of the capitalist class. Capitalism does not at all refer essentially to such personal appropriation in any simple sense. It is well known that for Marx the enemy is capital itself, the capitalist featuring merely as a, quote, quote, capital personified. If capital originally took the shape of such a, quote, capitalist, this is not definitional of the capital relation, which is purely a matter of capitals being individuated from one another as value bodies, and of the subordination of living labor by dead labor. Marx made an error in Volume 3 when he spoke of the joint stock company, parenthesis, made necessary by the increasing scale of the social productive forces, end parenthesis, as the negation of capitalism within capitalism. On the contrary, the alienation of any idiosyncrasy, the elimination of any idiosyncrasy which the person of an individual capitalist may introduce, when the individual capitalist is replaced by the corporate person, parenthesis, which in law is solely concerned with protecting the investments of the shareholders, end parenthesis, results in a purer form of capital. It is even possible as an imaginary experiment to see that capital can survive the elimination of the capitalist class. Already the institutions, such as pension funds and insurance companies, have a preponderant role in shareholdings. It is only necessary to imagine that as a result of a punitive inheritance tax, the individual capitalists are driven out and the slack taken up by these institutions. But if the corporations were all owned by pension funds, this would change nothing about the fundamental metabolism. Parenthesis, just as in feudalism, church estates, the beneficiaries of which owned no property, were generally run in the same way as those of the lord's temporal, end parenthesis. Now let us turn to Maceros' definition of capital. It is a structural requirement of Maceros' argument that the criteria be more abstract than those of capitalism, so that capitalism may be relegated to one form of the capital system, but it must not be so abstract as to comprehend systems in which no capital relation could plausibly be said to exist. I think this remit is impossible to fulfill and is not in truth fulfilled by Maceros. Maceros' four-part definition of capital may be reduced to a two-part one because items 1, 2, and 4 are all about the alienation of the laborer, while only point 3 refers to the presence of capital, which is defined here as, quote, egoistic value pursuing its own self-expansion, end quote. However, it is unclear how seriously we are meant to take the term, quote, value here, because Maceros generally talks not of surplus value, but of surplus labor. For example, Maceros says, quote, capital accumulation in the USSR was, quote, secured by means of politically controlled extraction of surplus labor, end quote. Maceros. But it is impermissible to play fast and loose with, quote, surplus value and, quote, surplus labor. The existence of surplus labor, as it is common to all exploitative modes of production, does not at all prove the existence of capital, which is accumulated value via profit on any reasonable reading of Marx. That's a very important sentence. But it is impermissible to play fast and loose with, quote, surplus value and, quote, surplus labor. The existence of surplus labor, as it is common to all exploitative modes of production, does not at all prove the existence of capital, which is accumulated value via profit on any reasonable reading of Marx. What on earth is Marx's concept of capital if it has no reference to value, surplus value, or profit? What on earth is his concept of capital if it has no reference to value, surplus value, or profit? It can only relate to the so-called organic system of metabolic control understood in use value terms, that the very organization of material production qualifies here as capital, and that in virtue of that material organization, it subordinates labor to its purpose of uncontrolled self-expansion, in which the latter must be understood not as valorization, but as an expansion of physical plant. There are two things wrong here. Such a system would not constitute capital accumulation, which is necessarily a value form, and there was in the USSR no imminent tendency to self-expansion, but everyone would agree that capital is inherently accumulation-driven. Indeed, Maceros goes out of his way to argue that this was still true in the USSR. Quote, the imperative of accumulation-driven expansion can be satisfied under changed economic circumstances, not only without the subjective, quote, profit motive, but even without the objective requirement of profit, which happens to be an absolute necessity only in the capitalist variety of the capital system, ... During several decades of Soviet economic development, high levels of capital accumulation, were, secured by means of the politically controlled extraction of surplus labor, without remotely resembling the capitalist system in its necessary orientation towards profit. End quote. Maceros. This seems very odd to me. In capitalism, we see the hegemony over production of value forms, including especially capital, not production for production's sake, but for the sake of profit. This seems very odd to me. In capitalism, we see the hegemony over production of value forms, including especially capital, not production for production's sake, but for the sake of profit. Capital as a subject is essentially a value form and cannot survive the abolition of profit. What was accumulated in the USSR, however, was not capital, but means of production lacking the form of capital. Moreover, the accumulation fetish was not rooted in the, quote, metabolic order, but in the hopes of the controllers, who imposed external, quote, targets, terroristically driven. If the USSR as a, quote, capital system was really expansion-oriented, how is it that compatible with the failure to innovate, which led to permanent stagnation? No matter how the political authority, for external reasons of state, tried to coerce or stimulate the producers, the economy responded only sluggishly in quantitative terms, and innovation became completely bogged down. Footnote: an important technical point is that where relative surplus value is concerned, this is premised on competition between capitals. Without this, relations of domination may well promote absolute surplus value production and extensive growth, but this is insufficient to power dynamic growth intensively. End footnote. This was crucial politically, for the failure to, quote, catch up with the West and the failure to achieve real growth in the Brezhnev years stripped the system of legitimacy even in the eyes of its beneficiaries and brought about the implosion. Meszaros argues in his point 3 that the bureaucrat is the post-capitalist equivalent of the private capitalist as the representative of capital. The bureaucrat is certainly the representative of a material metabolism so structured as to expropriate the subjectivity of the workers, but his interest in controlling the workers is not in expansion per se, but simply in meeting externally imposed targets. Hence neither capital nor any new personification of capital, the bureaucracy, can be present. What is true is that, as it inherited the materialization of capital, the Soviet factory was characterized by a hierarchical division of labor and the subordination of the immediate producers to alien purposes. Saying this, we have now reduced Meszaros' definition effectively to the other 3 points to do with the claim that the USSR, like capitalism, rested on the exploitation of alienated labor. Let us examine Meszaros' claims in relation to this other part of his core definition of capital, namely the following, quote, the separation and alienation of the objective conditions of the labor process from labor itself, end quote. Quote, the superimposition of such objectified and alienated conditions over the workers as a separate power exercising command over labor, end quote, for the sake of the pursuit of, quote, self-expansion. Clearly there is, end quote. Sorry, there's no end quote there, excuse me. For the sake of, Jesus Christ, I gotta repeat that whole last bit, I fucked it up. Let us examine Meszaros' claims in relation to the other part of his core definition of capital, namely the following, quote, the separation and alienation of the objective conditions of the labor process from labor itself, end quote. Quote, the superimposition of such objectified and alienated conditions over the workers as a separate power exercising command over labor, end quote, for the sake of the pursuit of, quote, self-expansion. Clearly, there is considerable room for discussion about such a definition of capital. As I have already argued, without the drive of self-valorization infusing the conditions of production, there is no imminent tendency to expansion. On the other hand, it is true that the organization of labor, both materially and socially, is at first sight directed towards exercising, quote, command over labor, end quote. However, the empirical record, see books cited earlier, shows that this failed miserably to achieve its objectives precisely because the, quote, mode of production within which the factories were now set was radically changed. There is an interesting contrast between the Marx of 1844, who assimilated feudalism and capitalism under the general category of alienation of the conditions of labor from the worker, and the Marx of 1857, who was concerned to sharply demarcate capitalist from pre-capitalist forms on the grounds that in capitalism the worker was at the mercy of the decisions of the private owner in finding work, whereas in feudalism the communal system of production was prior to and included the immediate producer. Now, if we think about this distinction of 1857, then we can see that in the USSR the, quote, community was also prior to labor in that, just as in feudalism, the worker must work but cannot be fired. Therefore, Meszaros' inclusion of the term, quote, separation in the above definition is mistaken. Strictly speaking, there is no separation of workers from the conditions of production. The Soviet manager was stuck with the workers just as the feudal estates carried its complement of serfs. The Marx of 1844 read feudalism as another system in which the conditions of labor are dominant over the workers. The Marx of 1857 insists that capitalism is different from feudalism, in that in feudalism the worker is presupposed as in unity with the conditions, whereas in capitalism he is separated from them and, quote, seeking work. Now it is obvious that the USSR conforms to the feudal model. Even if the conditions are dominant over the worker, it is still true that there is the presupposed community, which both forces people to work and supposedly guarantees work. Just as in feudalism, the powerlessness of the immediate producer was politically grounded in the USSR, rather than on the economic, quote, separation from the conditions of production. If anything, they were part of these conditions. One second, I gotta copy that down. Sorry about that. Come on. God damn it. Come on, you sack of shit. Alright. Sorry. I'm having difficulties. Back to the text. Macero's strongest argument is that real subsumption of labor under capital was retained in the USSR. Originally, this was organized in capital's interest to produce value. Hence, capital's obsession with time saving and the expropriation of control over the production process from the immediate producer. But when the factory is detached from the value regulator and enters into a new relation of production, there is a significant loss of such, quote, command, as the empirical studies show. Yet Maceros rightly includes, quote, command as a sine qua non of the capital relation, and hopes for the, quote, total eradication of capital from the social metabolism as command over labor, end quote, Maceros. Maceros supports himself with a couple of quotations which do lend some color to his position, in particular a passage from the Grundrisse in which Marx speaks of the, quote, monstrous objective power, end quote, belonging to, quote, the personified conditions of production, i.e. to capital, end quote. Marx, Grundrisse. This is key to Maceros' whole position. My own position is the converse, that the monstrous power of the conditions of production over labor is due to its being the materialization of the capital form, where capital's personification arises from the acquired independence of value, and more specifically, the domination of self-valorizing value as a form, the objective conditions being shaped into its content. The, quote, monstrous power of the factory organization is shaped by the imperative of valorization and is hence the materialization of capital. Although the factory system is tailor-made to expropriate the subjectivity of the worker, the counter-subject that exercises command is self-valorizing value, not its material integument. To identify the source of the problem with the factories, rather than with the factory's social form, is an easy mistake when the conditions of labor are form determined by capital. But that organization extracted from that organization's social form has no inherent drive to expand. This view falsely assumes the only way it can function is that is as it was designed to do, and hence calls forth for its appropriate personification a replacement of the private capitalist for the private capitalist. So if it functions in the same way as in capitalism, we might as well say it is capital. That is what Masiros seems to imagine. At the deepest philosophical level, Masiros overgeneralizes the notion of a subject-object reversal. Quote, originally, the subject is the producer and the object is the conditions of production, including the tools wielded by the worker. If one simply inverts this, then the worker becomes the object to be, quote, commanded, and the subject becomes, quote, the personified conditions of production, end quote, which is clearly how Masiros understands capital. But, even though Marx gives warrant for this reading in some of his remarks, this is a wrong-headed account of what actually occurs in capitalism. For what it is worth, in 1867, Marx defines capital as a, quote, subject. Long before Marx discusses production, he clearly bases it on the, quote, developed movement of circulation, end quote, namely money, commodity, money. It doesn't say money, commodity, money prime, it just says money, commodity, money. In practice, when Masiros discusses in detail how exactly capital has established itself, Masiros concentrates not on the forms of circulation, but on the level of production, even though it is true that the worker experiences the conditions of production as an alien power. Indeed, the worker experiences even his own labor as alien. This is misleading, for the true subject, namely capital, is not the personified conditions. Even though it is true that the worker experiences the conditions of production as an alien power, indeed, he experiences even his own labor as alien. This is misleading, for the true subject, namely capital, is not the personified conditions of production, but self-valorizing value defined by the formula money, commodity, money. When this circuit sinks into production and becomes money, commodity, production, commodity, money, it constitutes the conditions of labor as alien to the worker. Masiros tries to go from labor, that is, alienated labor, to capital without taking seriously, quote, developed circulation. Thus, the way is open for him to identify alienated labor in the Soviet Union with the rule of capital, for he takes capital as identical with the estrangement of the material conditions of labor from the worker. Since such alienation continues in the USSR, Masiros misidentifies it as founded on capital. Masiros thinks that in capital is the autonomy of the material conditions of production that is the problem, whereas in fact, it is the autonomy of value and the imposition on production of self-valorizing value that is the root of the problem, the factory organization being the materialization of capital. Time and again, Masiros argues that capital continues in being until replaced by another organic system, namely socialism. What is missed here is the possibility of something stalled, the negation of capital, which is not the supersession of capital, an existent contradiction, therefore, thus precisely a system not organically coherent and therefore lacking any imminent motor of production, but a negation of capital that fails to go beyond capital, is necessarily a negation of capital that falls behind capital. Hence the perception of Soviet workers that they were serfs and their initial enthusiasm for the market as a liberation. Masiros is clearly right to argue that that socialist revolution is not merely a matter of a transfer of political power or of redistribution, but of changing the fundamental social metabolism established by capital. It means transforming the very structure of material production and abolishing the hierarchical division of labor. Masiros is clearly right that post-capitalist social formations failed to achieve this positive transcendence, and the emergence of, quote, the bureaucracy is explicable, primarily on that basis. Masiros' conceptualization of the problem in terms of the survival of, quote, capital beyond, quote, capitalism is most interesting, But although we both see, quote, the moment of capital in the USSR, what I call the materialization of capital, Mazeros identifies with capital itself. In the sense that something survives from the previous period, our views overlap. My difference with this account relates to what survives. This raises interesting issues about the concepts involved. Maseros identifies capital's social metabolism with the system of material interchanges. Maseros focuses on the factory system. This sounds thoroughly materialist, but in my view, this level of the social metabolism cannot be understood as having its own organic coherence and dynamic. It is only comprehensible as the bearer of and subordinated to an ideal metabolism, the interchange of values constitutive of the life of capital. Thus, the general line of my critique of Maseros is that Maseros pays insufficient attention to the value form of capital, and the positing of expansion inherent in capital's search for profit. Does this difference between my claim that the materialization of capital survives and the view of Maseros that capital survives amount to no more than semantics? No, because my view gives a better explanation of collapse. Conclusion. I argue that in the Soviet Union, capital's metabolism was disrupted without an alternative being established. Lacking organic coherence, the system could not survive once the exceptional period conditions of revolutionary mobilization, of terror, and of war passed. The USSR has to be seen as the negation of socialism within socialism. I don't like that. Anyway, the USSR has to be seen as the negation of socialism within socialism, and tendentially refounding capitalism has indeed occurred. This is because the benefits of social ownership are only possible with self-management. But where materialized capital remained, without the capitalist economic form to direct it, there was nothing to motivate efficiency, voluntarism, coercion, incentives all failed. Hence, the chronic crisis of underutilization of resources, massive waste, defective products, and final collapse. Certainly, if the factory system in which capital materialized itself remains, then one cannot speak of socialism, but conversely, if the law of value enforced through capitalist competition is no longer operative, we have a clock without a spring. That's the end of this chapter. Thank you so much for listening.